It was 1855 when Thomas Addison first described the disease that would eventually bear his name. He cataloged the physical destruction, the bronze skin, the wasting away, the heart growing faint. But he also noted something else, something that for over a century largely disappeared from the textbooks. He wrote about attacks of giddiness, anxiety, and delirium.
A full psychiatric profile right there in the founding document. Yet for decades, if a patient with adrenal insufficiency walked into a hospital seeing things that weren't there or screaming in paranoia, they weren't taken to the endocrine ward, they were taken to the psych ward.
And that is the terrifying gap we are stepping into today. We're looking at an article from My Adrenal Life titled Adrenal Psychosis, When Cortisol Loss Affects the Brain. It covers a specific haunting reality for people with adrenal insufficiency, the moment when the body's metabolic crash looks from the outside exactly like a mental breakdown.
It is haunting because it is a biological trick. The brain is an organ. It runs on fuel. When the adrenal glands fail, whether that's primary Addison's, secondary, or tertiary insufficiency, the fuel line is cut. The article describes this sensation as unfamiliar, not just tired, not just foggy, but a fundamental disconnection from reality.
The descriptions are vivid. We aren't talking about being a little cranky because your blood sugar is low. We are talking about hallucinations, paranoia, agitation so severe it looks like a manic episode. And the user's prompt specifically mentions the fear of being dismissed or misdiagnosed. That seems to be the central tension here. The patient knows something is physically wrong, but the world sees a psychiatric emergency.
Precisely, and that fear is grounded in medical history. In the 1950s, researchers actually documented neuropsychiatric symptoms in up to 70% of Addison's patients. They called it a forgotten phenomenon in later papers because, as our diagnostic tools for the physical body got better, we stopped listening to the mental symptoms. But the mechanism is brutal. When cortisol drops, you aren't just losing stress regulation, you're losing the conductor of an entire metabolic orchestra.
Let's break down that orchestra, because the article mentions 3 specific failures that lead to this state: low blood sugar, low sodium, and low blood pressure. How do those translate into "I'm seeing bees that aren't there"?
Think of it as a 3-front war on the brain. First, hypoglycemia. Cortisol helps regulate glucose. Without it, your blood sugar crashes. The brain is an energy hog. It needs glucose to function. When that supply drops, you get neuroglycanemia. That's not just hunger, that is confusion, aggression, and eventually loss of consciousness. It's the brain starving in real time.
So that explains the confusion and maybe the agitation. What about the hallucinations?
That often ties into the second front, hyponatremia, low sodium. In primary adrenal insufficiency, you lose aldosterone, the hormone that holds on to salt. When sodium drops critically low, water rushes into the cells to balance it out. This causes cerebral edema, swelling of the brain. The brain is literally squeezed inside the skull. That pressure disrupts neural firing, leading to visual hallucinations and profound disorientation. One case study described a patient seeing swarms of bees and blacking out. That is a brain under siege.
That is a terrifying image. The brain swelling against the skull explains why this feels so different from standard depression or anxiety. It's mechanical failure.
And then you have the third front, which is more subtle but equally powerful. The glucocorticoid receptors, the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for memory and emotional regulation, is absolutely packed with receptors waiting for cortisol. It needs that signal to maintain plasticity and mood stability. When the cortisol signal goes dead, the hippocampus malfunctions. You get memory gaps, disjointed thinking, and that unfamiliar feeling the article highlights.
It's interesting you mentioned memory gaps. The article talks about patients feeling disconnected from reality or having disorganized thinking.
It sounds almost like a temporary dementia.
It can mimic that, yes. There is also a fascinating hormonal feedback loop involving ACTH. In primary Addison's, because the adrenals aren't working, the pituitary gland screams for help by pumping out massive amounts of ACTH. But ACTH is derived from a larger molecule called POMC, which also produces endorphins. Some researchers theorize that this flood of endorphins and other precursors might actually lower the threshold for psychosis.
So the brain is starving for sugar, swelling from water retention, the memory center is offline, and the pituitary is flooding the system with excess hormones. It's a perfect storm.
And yet, if you walk into an ER in that state, unless the doctor checks your sodium or sees a medical alert bracelet, you look like a standard psychiatric admission. There is a statistic that around 50% of adrenal insufficiency patients are misdiagnosed with a psychiatric condition, depression, bipolar, even schizophrenia, before they get their proper diagnosis.
That brings us to the lived experience the article emphasizes, the fear of losing control. If you are the patient, you are trapped inside this collapsing building, but everyone outside is just telling you to calm down. That has to be traumatizing.
The trauma is twofold. First, the event itself is terrifying. Patients describe it as a darkness or a fog that turns sinister. But the second trauma is the shame that follows. The article touches on this, the embarrassment after recovery. You might have accused your spouse of poisoning you, or screamed at a nurse, or been unable to recognize your own children. When the cortisol is replaced and the brain clears, you remember those things. But you have to understand, that wasn't you. That was metabolic disruption.
There is a massive irony here that we need to address. Most people hear steroids and psychosis and think of roid rage, too much cortisol, or high-dose prednisone causing mania. But we are saying the exact opposite causes the same behavior.
It is the great paradox of endocrinology. Both extremes of the spectrum, Cushing's, too much cortisol, and Addison's, too little cortisol, can manifest as psychosis. But the treatment is opposite. If you treat an adrenal crisis psychosis with antipsychotics alone, and you don't give the cortisol, the patient could die. The psychosis is a warning sign of impending cardiovascular collapse. If you assume it's steroid psychosis and withhold steroids, you kill the patient.
That is a critical distinction for caregivers. The article mentions that caregivers might witness sudden personality shifts. If I'm a husband or a wife watching this happen, my instinct might be to back off or to try to reason with them. But if this is a metabolic crash, reasoning isn't going to work.
Reasoning is useless against hyponatremia. The caregiver needs to be a detective. If the person with adrenal insufficiency becomes suddenly agitated, paranoid, or confused, you don't ask, "What's wrong emotionally?" You ask, "When was your last dose? Have you been vomiting? Is there an infection?" You look for the physical trigger. The personality change is a symptom, just like a fever or a rash.
The article explicitly states these episodes are not personality changes. They are not character flaws. That feels like the core message the author wants to get across. It's a plea for validation.
It is validation of the biology, and it changes the action plan. If you see these signs, you don't call a therapist. You might need to inject Cortef. You check blood pressure. You get to an ER. The article mentions that stability returns when physiology is corrected. We have case reports of patients in full catatonic psychosis, completely unresponsive, who return to their normal selves within hours of IV hydrocortisone. The brain is resilient, but it is dependent.
Let's widen the lens a bit. This condition, adrenal insufficiency, is rare, but the article notes it applies to primary, secondary, tertiary, and iatrogenic types. Does the risk of this brain crash apply equally to all of them?
The risk is present in all, but the flavor might differ. In primary Addison's, you have the mineralocorticoid loss, the salt wasting, which makes the hyponatremia and brain swelling more likely. That's where you get those really dramatic delirium-like presentations. In secondary or tertiary, where the pituitary or hypothalamus is the issue, you usually preserve salt balance, but you still have the severe hypoglycemia and the cortisol receptor failure. So you might see less brain swelling, hallucinations, but profound confusion, lethargy, and paranoia from the low blood sugar and cortisol deficit.
And iatrogenic, that's steroid-induced, right? People who have been on long-term steroids for asthma or arthritis and then stop?
Exactly. And that is a huge hidden population. If someone has been on high-dose prednisone for months and stopped abruptly, their adrenal glands are asleep. They go into a crisis just like an Addison's patient. They can experience that same terrifying detachment from reality. It's often confusing for them because they don't identify as having an adrenal disease. They just think they stopped a medication.
We talked about the acute crisis, the dramatic hallucinations and paranoia, but the article also mentions fog and feeling disconnected. Is there a subclinical version of this, a slow burn?
Absolutely. Before the crisis hits, there is often a prodromal phase. Patients describe a low-resolution reality. Cognitive processing speed slows down. Finding words becomes difficult. Emotional regulation frays. You might cry over a spilled cup of coffee or feel a sudden surge of doom for no reason. This is the brain struggling to maintain homeostasis with insufficient fuel. It's a warning light on the dashboard.
And that warning light is what families need to watch for. The article mentions that for caregivers, this can be frightening, but it also gives us a path forward. This conversation can be held safely. How do you hold a safe conversation about psychosis?
You externalize it. You talk about the low cortisol brain as a state, distinct from the person. When the patient is stable, you make a plan. You say, if I start acting suspicious of you, or if I can't follow a simple sentence, we treat it as a medical emergency, not an argument. You agree on the signals beforehand. It takes the morality out of the madness.
It's like a diabetic with low blood sugar. We know that if a diabetic gets combative, you give them juice. You don't file for divorce. But because cortisol regulates mood and personality so directly, it feels more personal.
It feels intimate. Cortisol is the molecule of alertness, of engagement with the world. When it's gone, the person withdraws behind a veil, but the science shows us that the person is still there. The case report of the 63-year-old man who presented with only psychosis, no other physical symptoms, is a great example. He was treated with antipsychotics and got worse. He was given hydrocortisone, and the psychosis evaporated. The person came back.
That case study is wild. He had no physical signs, no low blood pressure?
He had hyponatremia, low sodium, but he was normal volemic, meaning his blood volume looked okay. His only major symptom was severe psychosis. It shows how the brain can sometimes be the canary in the coal mine, failing before the heart or the gut does.
This leads to a practical question for our listeners who might have this condition. If you are feeling that unfamiliar shift, that slide into the dark, what is the move? Do you stress dose?
The standard guidance, and of course we aren't giving individual medical advice, is that mental status changes are a sign of severe physiological stress. Many endocrinologists advise stress dosing, increasing the cortisol intake, when these symptoms appear, because they're a proxy for metabolic instability. If you are confused, you are already in the danger zone. Waiting to see if it passes is risky, because your judgment is the very thing that is being impaired.
Your brain is the instrument you use to decide if you need help, and the instrument is broken. That's the trap.
Which is why the medical alert bracelet and the educated caregiver are non-negotiable. You need an external brain to make the call when yours goes offline.
The article closes on a note of dignity. Your brain deserves the same medical respect as the rest of your body. It's a powerful line. We treat the heart stopping with CPR. We treat the kidneys failing with dialysis. But when the brain falters due to this same disease, we tend to whisper about it.
We revert to stigma. We think crazy instead of crisis. But if we look at the biology, the glucose deprivation, the electrolyte imbalance, the receptor failure, it is as mechanical as a broken bone. Understanding that doesn't just help the medical treatment. It heals the shame. It allows the patient to look back at that terrifying episode and say, I wasn't losing my mind. I was losing my cortisol.
That reframing is vital. It turns a source of fear into a solvable puzzle. We've covered the mechanics, the history, and the emotional toll. As we wrap up, what is the one thing you want a patient or a loved one to take away from this? If they are sitting in that fear right now.
You are not imagining it. The article says it clearly. If you experienced mental status changes, you are not imagining it. The fear, the fog, the paranoia, it is real, but it is chemical. And because it is chemical, it is fixable. You are not broken. You are just uncalibrated. And with the right support and the right treatment, stability returns.
Stability returns. A good place to end. If you know someone navigating adrenal insufficiency, send them this episode. It might just be the validation they've been looking for.